So hi everyone, since we do not have classes tomorrow due to transport strike, so I'm going to discuss online the uh, discussions about chapter 5, which is repetition control structure. Although we started already discussing some parts of the repetition structure, specifically the for loop and the while loop, but let me discuss to you the chapters of Malik in chapter 5. So again, why is repetition needed? Repetitions allows you to efficiently use the variables. So instead of, like for example, if we are going to add 5 numbers again, so we're not going to declare 5 variables to add 5 numbers. Instead, we're going only to declare a variable, a single variable, and of course, we need to include also a counter that will count the number of input numbers. So we discussed it already during our discussion last Monday before we have our quiz number 2. So again, let's just review what is a while loop syntax again. So again, the general form for the while loop is while, and then including a parenthesis, that's part of the syntax, and including the expressions or the testing condition. So you already know how to do the while loop statement last time. And then I'm going to give you more examples later on, okay, to design a while loop. Then we discuss also cases of how are we going to use a while loop. First case is the counter controlled loop. Okay, so if you know exactly how many pieces of data need to be read, we can actually use a while loop. A counterpart of while loop for counter controlled loop is also using the for loop. So meaning if you know the number of iterations or how many times you need to input the data, you may use either the while loop or the for loop. Next is case 2 sentinel controlled loop. So we need to use a sentinel variable to be tested in the condition to end the loop. So we need to use a sentinel controlled loop on that case. And for case 3, we can also use a flag controlled for while loop. A flag controlled while loop uses a boolean variable to control the loop. Okay, so we discussed this already last time. Okay, later on I'm going to give you a number guessing game using a RAND sample or a RAND syntax sample. Okay. And we already also discussed this sequence of numbers, like for example, a Fibonacci series. So we have this already, and we answered this already using the while loop and the for loop. Okay. So after the while loop, let's see the general form again for the for loop. So again, for loop initially has this syntax. We have the keyword for followed by the parentheses. So again, parentheses is needed and required from the syntax. Inside the parentheses are the initial statement or the initializing list separated with a comma. Another expression will be the loop condition separated again with a semicolon rather, and then another expression which is the update statement. Okay, so again, this one is actually used if our loop is a counter controlled loop, meaning we need to know or we already know how many times the loop will be executed. Okay, for do while loop, the general form for do while loop is do and then statement and then while and then followed by the parentheses. Again, it is required in the syntax and then an expression. So a do while loop is actually categorized as a post-test loop, while the two loops, which is the for loop and the do while loop, is actually categorized as the pre-test loop. So in do while loop, the statement execute first and then the expression is evaluated. Okay? So in this case, most of the time, again, as mentioned in the laboratory, most of the time, do while loop actually used for validating values. Let's say, for example, if you want to validate the numbers and you want to accept only positive numbers, for example, so you may use do while loop to validate the number. Even, for example, by answering the questions do you want to try again and answer it by yes or no. You can also validate the input number for yes or no. Okay, so using the do while loop. Okay, and so how are we going to choose the right loop again for this type of structure? So we all know that there are three loops, okay, in C++. So all three loops have their place in C++. So let's say, for example, if you know or can determine in advance the number of repetitions needed, the for loop is the correct choice. If you do not know and cannot determine in advance the number of repetitions needed, it could be 0. Okay? We use a while loop. Okay? Instead, if you do not know and cannot determine in advance the number of repetition needed, and it is at least once, we can perform a do while loop on that. Okay, so later on, after this discussion, I'm going to give you an example of, again, a code for loop, while loop, and do while loop. Okay, then I'm going to discuss also what is a break in the program. Okay, so as mentioned in the laboratory, break means it's like stopping the execution or forcing force exit the looping statement. It can be used from either while loop and for loop, and as well as in a do while loop. Same thing as continue. Instead of stopping the execution of the loop, we are going to use continue to, for example, if we want to validate something again, instead of using a do while loop, we can use actually a while loop, then including a continue syntax, so that we can actually ask again the user to re-enter the number. So that's actually the use of continue syntax. I'm going to give you an example of that later on. And then lastly, the discussion about the nested control structure. When we say nested control structure, this is actually a loop within a loop. So how are we going to use nested control structures in CS126? This is actually used to create patterns. Okay, so later on we're going to again code patterns, such as, for example, if we want to display this kind of right triangle, and we're going to declare it, like, for example, the number of size of columns and the number of size of the rows, and then we're going to code it and display on screen asterisk sign, but the object for an asterisk sign would be a product of a right triangle. Even this one, we're going to discuss this. If we want, for example, to flip the right triangle, okay, how are we going to do that? So instead of this code, the I++ and the J++, we can actually use minus minus for the I. Okay, so later on, we're going to perform that as well. So now, if we want to avoid bugs by avoiding patches, okay, so some programmer address the symptom of the problem by adding a software patch. Should instead resolve underlying issue. So software patch is actually a piece of code written on top of an existing piece of code. Or software patch is intended to fix a bug in the original code. Okay, so how are we going to debug loops? Okay, loops are harder to debug than the previous topics, such as sequential programming structures and selection programming structure. Okay, because loop actually uses different variants. Okay, so set of statements that remains true each time the loop body is executed, and the most common error associated with loop is off by 1. Okay, so meaning it's actually difficult to debug loop compared to the other topics, such as sequential and selection structures, because you need to first iterate or simulate the loop before you need to know what is the problem of the loop. Unlike sequential is just like input processing and output. You can easily determine your bugs or your problem with the program, especially also in selection structures. It's actually easily you can actually easily detect errors using the selection structure. For example, if you're going to use if statement, no, so you can actually determine easily the problem compared to looping statements. You need first to simulate it. Then after simulating, if you see that there are problems, you can actually debug already the problem. Okay, I have here some examples, and we're going to do that after discussing everything.